The air in Courtroom for B was thick with the ghosts of forgotten pleas and the faint, cloying scent of lemon-scented floor polish that failed to mask the deeper odor of institutional despair. It was an old room, a cavern of dark wood and cracked leather, where justice was dispensed under the tired buzz of fluorescent lights that flickered with the rhythm of a dying heart. Sarah Jenkins sat on the edge of a rigid bench, her knuckles white where she gripped a worn leather purse in her lap. The purse had been her mother's, and it was the only thing in the room that felt like it belonged to her. Everything else, the cold, impersonal space, the condescending glances, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders, was alien territory. She felt like a specimen under glass, pinned and labeled. Single mother, insufficient, failing. Her blouse, a pale blue she'd bought on clearance 2 years ago, had a tiny, meticulously mended tear near the collar, a testament to a life lived on the frayed edges of solvency. Her shoes were scuffed at the toes, a detail she tried to hide by tucking her feet beneath the bench, but she could feel the judge's gaze lingering on them anyway. He saw everything. Judge Alistair Finch presided from his elevated throne of justice like a bored monarch. His face was a mask of patrician indifference, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his black robes immaculate. He had the soft, unblemished hands of a man who had never known a day of manual labor, and he used them to gesture dismissively as Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, a young man with more ambition than experience, stammered through a weak defense. Sarah wasn't really listening to him. She was listening to the silence of the room, a silence that amplified the frantic thumping of her own heart. Across the aisle sat the reason she was here, Eleanor and Robert Worthington, her late husband's parents. They were statues of cold fury, dressed in shades of expensive gray, their faces etched with a disapproval that had been aimed at her since the day their son, Mark, had brought her home. They wanted her son, their grandson, Leo. They had filed a petition for custody, citing her financial instability and her unsuitable living environment. Their lawyer, a shark named Mr. Davies with a smile that never reached his eyes, was currently painting a grim portrait of her life for the court. A life of poverty, he called it. A life of struggle that no child should have to endure. Sarah felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. It wasn't untrue. Life was a struggle. She worked 2 jobs, a pre-dawn shift waiting tables at a Greasy Spoon diner and a late-night shift cleaning office buildings. Sleep was a luxury she rarely afforded. But Leo had never gone hungry. He had never been without clean clothes, or books to read, or a kiss goodnight. He had never, for one single second, been without love. How did you enter love as evidence in a court of law? How did you quantify the warmth of a bedtime story or the security of a hand to hold on the walk to school? You couldn't. So all they saw were the numbers, the low income, the small apartment in the bad part of town, the scuffed shoes. The verdict was being written on their faces long before the judge would ever speak it. Judge Finch held up a hand, silencing her lawyer mid-sentence. The young man's mouth snapped shut, his face flushing with embarrassment. Finch leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished bench, and steepled his fingers. He looked down at Sarah, not as a man looking at a woman, but as an entomologist examining an uninteresting insect. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice a silken weapon, smooth and sharp. "Let us be frank. The documents before me paint a rather bleak picture." He picked up a sheaf of papers, waving them slightly. "You work 2 menial jobs. Your declared income is barely above the poverty line. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment with your 7-year-old son. The Worthingtons, on the other hand," he gestured with his chin toward the gray statues, "are offering the boy a life of stability, a large home, private education, a future. What, precisely, can you offer him that competes with that?" The question hung in the stale air. It wasn't a question. It was a condemnation. Sarah felt her lawyer place a tentative hand on her arm, a signal to stay quiet, to let him handle it. But she couldn't. This was not about legal strategy anymore. This was about her son. She rose slowly to her feet, her legs trembling slightly. The worn fabric of her skirt rustled, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the charged silence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but clear, devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul. I can't offer him a trust fund. I can't give him a pony or a trip to Europe. She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. But my home is not unstable. It's filled with love. I can give him my time. I can teach him to be kind, to be honest, to respect others. I can make sure he knows every single day that he is the most important person in the world to someone. I can give him a mother. She paused, her heart aching with the simple, profound truth of her words. I can give him everything that matters. For a moment, the judge's mask of indifference seemed to crack. He stared at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then it was gone. His lips curled into a sneer. A short, sharp, barking sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a full-bellied laugh, but something far more cruel. A chuckle of pure, unadulterated contempt. Love? Judge Finch scoffed, shaking his head as if she were a naive child. Madam, love does not pay the bills. Love does not secure a child's future. It is a sentiment, and this court deals in facts, not sentiment. The laughter, small as it was, echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. It struck Sarah with physical force, stealing the air from her lungs. The Worthingtons smirked. Mr. Davies looked smugly down at his notes. The bailiff stared blankly at the wall. In that moment, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her hope begin to crumble into dust. The world had judged her and found her wanting. The judge's cruel chuckle died, but its phantom echo remained, clinging to the heavy silence of the room. Sarah stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, creeping tide that threatened to drown her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to fold into herself until she was nothing but a memory. But then she thought of Leo. She thought of his bright, trusting eyes, the way his small hand fit so perfectly in hers. She thought of his laughter, a sound so pure it could cleanse the world of its ugliness. And she thought of Mark. The memory of her late husband rose in her mind, not as a ghost of grief, but as a pillar of strength. She could almost smell the familiar scent of motor oil and sawdust that always clung to his clothes. Mark had been a mechanic, a craftsman with his hands. He could listen to an engine and diagnose its troubles like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. Their life hadn't been one of riches, but it had been rich in other ways. Their tiny house had been loud with laughter and the smell of Sarah's baking. He had built Leo's first crib with his own 2 hands, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as silk. Character, Sarah girl, he used to say, his hands stained with grease but his eyes bright with conviction. That's the one thing they can't take from you. Money comes and goes. Houses can burn down. But your character, that's the foundation you build your life on. He had died 2 years ago. A drunk driver running a red light on a Tuesday afternoon. The foundation of her life had shattered. The grief was a physical weight, a constant companion in the empty house. Then came the bills, the medical debt, the mortgage, the sudden, terrifying reality of being utterly alone. She had sold the house, the one Mark's laughter still echoed in, and moved into the small apartment the Worthingtons' lawyer now described with such disdain. She had sold Mark's truck. She had taken the 2 jobs, working until her body ached and her mind was numb, all for Leo, all to keep her promise to Mark, a promise she'd whispered to him in the sterile, beeping quiet of the hospital room as his life slipped away. I'll protect him, she had sworn, her tears falling on his still hand. I'll raise him to be a good man. Like you, this courtroom, this judge, this cold assessment of her worth based on a bank statement. It was a betrayal of that promise. It was a desecration of Mark's memory. The Worthingtons had never approved of their son marrying a waitress. They saw her as beneath him, a common girl who had trapped their golden boy. After Mark's death, their polite condescension had curdled into open hostility. They saw Leo not as a child to be loved, but as a legacy to be claimed, a piece of their son they could possess and mold in their own image, erasing any trace of Sarah's influence. They didn't love Leo. They loved the idea of him. The thought stiffened her spine. The hot flush of shame receded, replaced by a cold, quiet anger. It was an anger born not of hate, but of fierce, protective love. They would not take her son. They would not erase Mark. She was more than her bank account. She was a wife who had loved her husband. She was a mother who adored her child. She was a woman who had faced down the darkest parts of life and had not broken. The pressure in the room was immense, a physical force pressing in from all sides. Mr. Davies, the Worthingtons' lawyer, sensed his advantage. He rose like a vulture circling its prey, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your Honor, while Ms. Jenkins' sentiments are touching," he said, the word touching laced with poison, "they do not change the facts. We have here a report from a court-appointed social worker." He lifted another document from his gleaming briefcase. While the social worker found no evidence of outright neglect, the report does raise serious concerns. He began to read excerpts, his voice carefully modulated to inflict maximum damage. "The apartment is cramped and located in a high-crime neighborhood. The boy, Leo, is often left in the care of a neighbor of questionable reliability. While Ms. Jenkins works her second job, Ms. Jenkins herself appeared chronically fatigued." Each phrase was a carefully aimed stone. Sarah felt her breath catch. The neighbor, Mrs. Gable, was a sweet, elderly widow who adored Leo and baked him cookies. The high-crime neighborhood was the only place she could afford, a community of hard-working people just like her. And chronically fatigued? Of course she was tired. She worked 18 hours a day to keep a roof over their heads. Davies wasn't just presenting facts. He was twisting them into a narrative of failure. He was building a cage of words around her. "Furthermore," Davies continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "we have concerns about the company Ms. Jenkins keeps, or rather, the company her late husband kept." He glanced at Sarah, a cruel glint in his eye. Mr. Jenkins was known to associate with disreputable elements. Motorcycle gangs, to be precise. "We have a photograph." He slid a glossy 8x10 photo across the table toward the judge. From her bench, Sarah could just make out the image. It was Mark years ago, laughing, his arms slung around a big, bearded man in a leather vest. The man was a biker. His name was Deacon. He had been one of Mark's best customers and, over time, a friend. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had brought them a lasagna after Leo was born and had cried at Mark's funeral. But in the cold, sterile light of the courtroom, the photo looked damning. A good man standing next to a symbol of everything this court considered dangerous and undesirable. "We simply want to ensure the boy is removed from such influences, Your Honor," Davies concluded, his voice oozing with sanctimony. "To give him a chance at a respectable life." The silence that followed was the most damning thing of all. No one spoke up for her. Her own lawyer shuffled his papers, his face pale and defeated. The clerk continued to type, her expression impassive. The bailiff stared ahead. The community of the court, the dozen or so strangers watching the proceedings, remained silent. Their silence was a form of consent. It was an agreement with the narrative being spun. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, with the full weight of the system, of wealth, of prejudice, bearing down on her. The judge picked up the photograph, his lip curling in disgust. He looked from the picture to Sarah, and his eyes were as cold and hard as granite. The final nail was being hammered into her coffin. The judge's derisive laugh still echoed in the hollows of Sarah's heart, a sharp, metallic sound that had tried to shatter her. But something inside her refused to break. It was the same resilient core that had allowed her to get out of bed every morning after Mark died. The same quiet strength that let her smile for Leo even when her soul was weeping. She looked at Judge Finch, at his condescending sneer and his robes of authority. She looked at the Worthingtons, their faces masks of smug victory. She looked at their lawyer, a man who wielded words like weapons to tear a mother from her child. And she felt not fear, but a profound, clarifying pity. They were the poor ones. Their world was so small, so bereft of the things that truly mattered. They measured life in square footage and stock portfolios, blind to the infinite value of a child's trust, deaf to the music of a life built on love and sacrifice. The shame that had threatened to consume her moments before was gone, burned away by the clean fire of her conviction. Her dignity, which they had tried to strip from her, settled back over her like a well-worn coat, familiar and warm. She had nothing left to lose, and in that, she found a strange and potent freedom. She straightened her spine, not in defiance, but in simple self-possession. Her gaze did not waver from the judge's face. When she spoke, her voice was no longer the quiet, pleading whisper of a victim. It was calm, measured, and imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with a gavel or a black robe. It was the authority of a mother's love. "Your Honor," she said, the formal address now carrying a subtle note of irony. "You are right. I am tired. I am tired every single day." She let the admission hang in the air. A stark and simple truth. "But my son has never seen me cry from that exhaustion. He has only seen me get up and go to work. He has seen me come home and help him with his homework. He has seen me mend his clothes and bake his birthday cakes. You call it fatigue. He calls it love in action." She turned her head slightly, her gaze falling upon the Worthingtons. Their smirks faltered under the weight of her directness. "You offer him a big house. I have taught him that a home is not the walls that surround you, but the people you share your life with. You offer him a private education. I am teaching him that intelligence is worthless without compassion. You talk about my late husband's friends," she said, her voice catching for just a second before steadying again. "My husband judged people by their hearts, not by their clothes or their bank accounts. That is a lesson I am proud to pass on to our son." She returned her focus to the judge, her eyes locking with his. "So, yes, by your standards I have nothing. But I am giving my son a childhood, not a financial plan. I am giving him a moral compass, not a stock portfolio. I am giving him a rich life, Your Honor. You just don't have the eyes to see it." She fell silent. She had not raised her voice. She had not wept. She had simply spoken her truth, laying it bare in the cold, judgmental heart of the courtroom. She had taken their contempt and held it up to the light, revealing its own emptiness. She had no more words. She had only her dignity. She stood there, a solitary figure in a worn blue blouse, and waited for the axe to fall. A profound silence descended upon Courtroom 4B, but this was a different kind of silence. The previous quiet had been one of indifference, of empty, stale air. This silence was heavy, charged, and electric. It was the sound of 100 assumptions being shattered at once. Sarah's words, spoken with such quiet, unyielding conviction, had landed not like a plea, but like a verdict of their own. For the first time all morning, Judge Finch looked truly unsettled. The smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of consternation. He stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, not as a case file or a statistic, but as a formidable presence. He shifted in his great chair, the leather groaning in protest. He had expected tears, hysterics, a desperate, broken plea. He had not expected this unshakable, regal dignity. It was a language he did not speak, and it unnerved him. Across the room, the change was palpable. The young, ambitious court clerk, a woman named Maria who had been typing with robotic efficiency, had stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and her gaze was fixed on Sarah, her expression a mixture of awe and dawning shame. She thought of her own mother, who had worked nights cleaning a hospital to put her through law school. In Sarah, she saw a reflection of a strength she had long taken for granted. In the back row, a weary-looking public defender who had been slumped in his seat, idly scrolling through his phone, slowly sat up straight. He'd seen 1,000 desperate people railroaded by the system, had grown numb to it over the years. But this was different. He caught the eye of the bailiff, a burly man named Gus who had been a fixture in this courtroom for 20 years. Gus, who normally looked as animated as the wood paneling, met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a sign of respect, a silent acknowledgement that they were witnessing something rare and true. Even Mr. Davies, the Worthingtons' lawyer, seemed to have lost his footing. His smug posture had deflated. He shuffled his papers, avoiding Sarah's gaze, suddenly looking less like a shark and more like a man who realized he had profoundly misjudged the tide. The Worthingtons themselves looked uncomfortable, their stony certainty beginning to crack. Sarah's words about Mark judging people by their hearts had been a direct hit. They knew it was true. Their son had always been drawn to authenticity, a quality they themselves lacked, and their resentment of Sarah was rooted in that very fact. The entire atmosphere of the room had shifted on the axis of Sarah's quiet courage. She had not won her case, not yet, but she had won the room. She had single-handedly transformed the narrative from one of her failure to one of their misjudgment. The silent bystanders were no longer indifferent observers. They were witnesses. The air crackled with anticipation, a feeling that the established order of this room had been irrevocably disrupted, and no one, least of all the judge, knew what was coming next. It began not as a sound, but as a vibration, a low, deep-throated tremor that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the courthouse. It was a physical sensation, a hum that traveled up through the soles of their shoes and resonated in their chests. Judge Finch paused, a frown creasing his brow. He glanced toward the tall, arched windows that overlooked the courthouse plaza. The hum grew, resolving itself into a distinct sound, the guttural, syncopated roar of Harley-Davidson engines. Not one or two, but a multitude, a rolling thunder that grew louder and louder, swallowing the ambient noise of the city. Inside the courtroom, heads turned. The bailiff, Gus, moved instinctively toward the door, his hand resting on his sidearm. The judge tapped his gavel, a feeble, tinny sound against the rising tide of noise. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" he demanded, but his voice was lost in the escalating roar. The sound was immense now, a physical wall of noise that made the window panes rattle in their frames. It was the sound of an approaching army. Then, as suddenly as it had swelled, the engine noise cut out. One by one, the thunderous reports ceased, replaced by a silence that was somehow more intimidating than the noise had been. It was a heavy, expectant silence, filled with the clicks and pings of cooling metal. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the courtroom's heavy oak doors. Then another and another. The doors swung open. They didn't burst open with violence, but were pushed with a deliberate, inexorable force. A man stood framed in the doorway. He was huge, both in height and breadth, with a long, graying beard braided into two sections. A roadmap of lines was etched around his eyes, testifying to a life lived under an open sky. He wore a leather vest, a cut, adorned with patches. On the back, in bold letters arching over a grim, grinning skull, were the words "Hell's Angels." This was Deacon, the man from the photograph. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the room with an unnerving calm. They passed over the lawyer, the clerk, the Worthingtons, before finally landing on Judge Finch. He held the judge's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable but radiating an aura of absolute authority. Then his eyes found Sarah. The hardness in them softened instantly, replaced by a look of profound concern and respect. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, and then they came. Behind Deacon, a river of leather and denim flowed into the courtroom. One by one, they filed in, each man a mountain of muscle and quiet menace. They were old and young, bearded and clean-shaven, but all wore the same uniform of defiance and brotherhood. They moved with a silent, disciplined economy, their heavy boots making no sound on the tiled floor. They filled the back benches, then the aisle, then stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. They did not speak. They did not threaten. Their sheer presence was enough. 10, 20, 50, then 70 of them. The room, already stuffy, became thick with the scent of road dust, worn leather, and gasoline. They were a living, breathing wall of unwavering loyalty, and they had just surrounded the heart of the city's judicial system. The bailiff's hand fell away from his weapon, his training useless against such an overwhelming, silent force. The judge sat frozen, his face a pale mask of shock and disbelief. The world had been turned upside down. The disreputable elements were no longer a photograph on a table. They were here and they were waiting. Deacon took a single step forward, the soft creak of his leather vest echoing in the stunned silence. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, like gravel being poured over velvet. "We heard you might need some folks to speak to your character." He said it not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Sarah, who had been as shocked as everyone else, felt a wave of disbelief wash over her, followed by a surge of warmth that pushed back the cold dread in her heart. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Deacon then turned his attention to the bench. He addressed Judge Finch with a formality that was more chilling than any threat. "Your Honor," he began, his eyes as steady and unblinking as a hawk's. "My name is Thomas Rourke. My friends call me Deacon. Mr. Davies," he nodded curtly at the pale-faced lawyer, "was kind enough to bring me up. I'd like permission to address the court regarding the character of Sarah Jenkins and her late husband, Mark." Judge Finch was trapped. The room was filled with 70 silent, intimidating men. To refuse would be to invite a confrontation he could not win. To agree was to cede the authority of his own courtroom. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You are not a party to this case, Mr. Rourke," he managed, his voice thin. "I'm a friend of the family," Deacon replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. A character witness, he didn't wait for a formal invitation. He walked to the witness stand, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a bear, and stood there. He did not sit. "Mark Jenkins," Deacon began, his voice filling the room, "was a better man than anyone in this room, myself included. He wasn't one of us. He never wore a patch. But he was our brother in every way that matters." He looked over at the Worthingtons, his gaze piercing. "You saw a grease monkey. We saw an artist. He had a gift. He could fix anything, and he never once overcharged a soul. When one of my boys was down on his luck, couldn't make rent, Mark would fix his bike for a handshake and a promise to pay it forward. He called it keeping the wheels turning." A low murmur of assent rumbled through the assembled bikers. "And when he died," Deacon's voice grew softer, laced with a grief that was still raw. "It left a hole. Not just in Sarah's life. In ours." He then turned his gaze back to Sarah, and his voice filled with a fierce tenderness. "And this woman has more honor in her little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. You talk about her poverty. Let me tell you about her wealth." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn notebook. After Mark passed, Sarah kept his garage open for a month, free of charge, to finish the jobs he'd already started, so his customers wouldn't be left hanging. She wouldn't take a dime. He looked at a page. She took all of Mark's tools that could have fetched thousands of dollars, and donated them to a youth outreach program we run. A program to keep at-risk kids from ending up on the wrong side of a courtroom like this one. He looked up, his eyes locking with the judge's. "Every Friday, after her shift at the diner, she brings whatever food is left over not to her own home, but to the St. James homeless shelter. Not for recognition, not for a tax receipt. Just because people are hungry." He held up the notebook. "This ain't a court document, Your Honor. This is a record of character. This is a ledger of love in action. You see a poor woman. We see a queen." The impact of Deacon's testimony was seismic. It sent shockwaves through the courtroom, rearranging the moral landscape of the entire proceeding. The abstract concept of character that Sarah had so eloquently defended was now being laid out with concrete, undeniable evidence. Deacon wasn't finished. He gestured to the 70 men standing silently behind him. "These men," he said, his voice resonating with pride. "They're not disreputable elements. They're plumbers, electricians, veterans, and small business owners. They're fathers and grandfathers. They look to Sarah Jenkins not as some charity case, but as an example of loyalty, of integrity, of quiet strength. She has never once asked us for anything, not after Mark died, not when the bills piled up, not ever. To ask for help would be to admit defeat, and that is not in her nature. So we respected her wish for independence. But we have been watching." Always his gaze swung back to the Worthingtons, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You talk about a respectable life," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You, who would use your money and your influence to tear a child from his mother's arms for your own selfish pride. You stand in this room and you dare to speak of respect? You don't know the meaning of the word. You are bankrupt in the only currency that matters." Robert Worthington shrank in his seat, his face ashen. Eleanor, for the first time, looked not angry, but ashamed, unable to meet Deacon's searing gaze. Judge Alistair Finch sat stunned, the gavel in his hand feeling as heavy as a block of lead. The neat, orderly world of legal precedent and financial statements he inhabited had been invaded by a messier, more profound truth. He looked at the file on his desk, at the cold, hard numbers that had seemed so definitive just minutes ago. They now looked like what they were, a shallow and incomplete story. He looked at Sarah Jenkins. He saw her not through the lens of his own privilege and prejudice, but through the eyes of the 70 men who had come to stand for her. He saw the mended tear on her blouse not as a sign of poverty, but as a badge of honor. He saw her exhaustion not as a weakness, but as a testament to her devotion. He saw the quiet dignity she had displayed as the bedrock of an unbreakable spirit. The law was his domain, but he suddenly felt like a trespasser in a matter of the human heart that was far beyond his jurisdiction. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. He picked up the custody petition filed by the Worthingtons, holding the document between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice strained, "in light of this testimony, do your clients wish to proceed?" Mr. Davies, looking utterly defeated, turned and conferred with the Worthingtons in a frantic, sibilant whisper. After a moment he straightened up, his face slick with sweat. "Your Honor," he stammered, my clients wish to withdraw their petition." A collective, silent exhale seemed to pass through the room. Judge Finch gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Petition withdrawn. This matter is dismissed. With prejudice," he added, the legal term a clear and final rebuke to the Worthingtons, barring them from ever bringing such a case again. He slammed his gavel down, not with anger, but with a resounding finality. "Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel's final crack was the signal for the spell to break. The bikers didn't cheer or shout. Their victory was as quiet and profound as their presence had been. As Judge Finch rose and swept from the room without making eye contact with anyone, Deacon stepped down from the witness stand. He walked over to Sarah, who was still standing by the bench, trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. The 70 men behind him remained in place, a silent, unmoving honor guard. Deacon stopped in front of her. The sheer size of him was intimidating, but his eyes were gentle. "You okay, Sarah?" he asked softly. She could only nod, tears finally beginning to well in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming, cathartic relief. "Mark would have been proud of you today," Deacon said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew." He then reached into his cut again, this time pulling out a thick, plain white envelope. He pressed it into her hand. "What is this?" she whispered, looking down at it. "It's Mark's back pay," Deacon said simply. "All those jobs he did on good faith, the boys have been paying into a fund for years, putting aside a little each month. Mark never wanted to take it. He said to save it for a rainy day." "Well, ma'am," he looked around the courtroom. "It looks like it's pouring." Sarah looked at the envelope, then back at Deacon, her eyes wide. "I can't take this, it's not charity," he said, his voice firm but kind. "It's a debt of honor. It's his, which means it's yours and Leo's now. You use it to get a better place, to fix your car, to take a day off. You use it to breathe." Before she could protest further, he gently closed her fingers around the envelope. Then, he did something that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. He leaned down and placed a soft, paternal kiss on her forehead. It was a gesture of profound respect, a benediction from the unlikeliest of priests. He then turned to the crowd of bikers. "All right," he rumbled. "Let's give the lady some air." As if on a silent command, the sea of leather parted. The bikers formed two lines, creating a wide, clear path from where Sarah stood all the way to the courtroom doors. It was an aisle of honor. Sarah looked down the path they had created for her. She clutched the envelope and her mother's old purse to her chest. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to walk. As she passed, each man, from the grizzled old-timers to the younger prospects, gave her a slow, respectful nod. There were no words, only the soft creak of leather and the silent, powerful acknowledgement of her worth. The court clerk, Maria, was crying openly now, a wide, happy smile on her face. The bailiff, Gus, stood at attention by the door, and as Sarah passed him, he tipped his head in a gesture of deference he usually reserved only for judges. She had walked into this room a dismissed, judged, and hopeless woman. She was walking out a queen, flanked by her royal guard. Sarah stepped out from the cool, dim courthouse into the bright, warm sunlight of the plaza. The sudden glare made her blink. The air smelled of freedom. The 70 bikers followed her out, their boots crunching on the pavement, their presence instantly altering the public space. Pedestrians gave them a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of fear and curiosity. They didn't see a group of men who had just upheld justice. They saw a stereotype. But the bikers paid them no mind. Their focus was solely on Sarah. They formed a loose, protective circle around her as she made her way toward the parking lot where her beat-up, 10-year-old sedan was parked. It was a strange and wonderful feeling to be encased in such a formidable shield of loyalty. No one would dare to bother her. No one would dare to look at her with anything less than respect. As she reached her car, she fumbled in her purse for her keys, her hands still shaking. Deacon was there, gently taking them from her and unlocking the door. He opened it for her, a gesture of old-world chivalry that seemed both out of place and perfectly fitting. "You get home safe to your boy," he said, his hand resting for a moment on the car's roof. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice full of an emotion too vast to name. "Thank you all." She looked past him at the sea of weathered faces, and she saw not a gang, but a family. Her family. Deacon just smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his rugged face. "No thanks necessary. We take care of our own. Mark was our own. That makes you and the boy our own, too. You ever need anything at all, you know who to call." He stepped back, and Sarah slid into the driver's seat. She started the engine, which coughed and sputtered to life. As she pulled out of the parking space, the bikers moved to their own machines. A moment later, a sound like a controlled earthquake erupted across the plaza as 70 Harley-Davidson engines roared to life in unison. It wasn't a sound of aggression or intimidation. It was a salute, a deafening, triumphant chorus of respect that echoed off the stone walls of the courthouse and reverberated through the heart of the city. People stopped and stared, their phones held up to record the incredible spectacle. Sarah drove away from the curb, and the motorcycles fell into formation around her. They became her escort, a rolling fortress of chrome and steel. They flanked her on all sides, clearing a path through the city traffic. Other cars simply pulled over, their drivers staring in amazement. She drove not as a single mom in a failing car, but as the matriarch of a powerful clan. As she neared her own neighborhood, the bikers began to peel off, one by one in small groups, with a final rev of their engines and a raised fist of solidarity. By the time she turned onto her own street, only Deacon was left, trailing her at a respectful distance. He followed her all the way to her apartment building, waiting until she had parked and gotten out of the car. He gave her one last nod, then turned his bike around and roared off into the distance, his job complete. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, watching until he was gone. She held the thick envelope in one hand and her old purse in the other. She was still tired. She was still a single mother with a long road ahead. But she was not alone. She was not invisible. She had been seen, and she had been honored. She walked into her building, her head held high, the roar of the engine still echoing in her ears. The sound of respect, earned and delivered.